Good morning, everybody. Today I wanted us to take a look at the constitutional principle of federalism. Federalism is the idea that the national government and state government share powers. What I think is interesting is that typically students tend to think that the national government has all the power. They're the ones that call all the shots. But it's important to remember that the states have the 10th Amendment that says that any powers not explicitly granted to the national government belong to the state governments. Yes, the national government has the supremacy clause. The question is which one wins in each situation? It's not as clean cut as you think it might be. Now, it's important to kind of put the idea of our federal system of government in context, because under the British, the American colonists experienced a unitary government, whereas the king and the parliament called all the shots. Well, they replaced that after the Revolution, or even during the Revolution, with the Articles of Confederation that proved far too weak. So they kind of went with the Goldilocks approach of something in between, where they wanted something where power was shared between the state governments and the national government. And that's how they ended up with a federal system of government. But that's led to a great deal of conflict between the national and state governments. States are arguing that they can't pay all that's necessary for Obamacare, or they argue, you know what, federal government, we don't like the way that you're enforcing federal immigration law, so we're going to have our sanctuary cities and sanctuary states that the national government's charged is a flat-out defiance of the national laws. Likewise with state laws on marijuana. They've passed medical marijuana laws, and they've even passed recreational marijuana laws, but those flaunt in the face of national drug law. And that's the interesting thing about federalism. I imagine you also have some more recent examples with COVID-19, with certain states deciding to open up even before the Trump administration says that they should. And that's the nature of federalism. You're going to have those kinds of tensions at play. Now, some view the split between national government power and state and local power like a ladder, where the US Constitution is at the top and local laws at the bottom. And I could certainly see an argument being made for there. It certainly helps for simplicity's sakes. But remember, this kind of takes it as a unitary government where the US Constitution is on the top. Whereas federalists would typically argue that the US Constitution is equal to state constitutions. So it is a little trickier than that, but do understand that in many cases, if not most, the supremacy clause within the US Constitution will win. And that can be demonstrated here with McCulloch versus Maryland. Maryland attempted to tax the national bank located within its boundaries, as they would any type of business or residency within the state. But the Marshall Court, that was led by a Federalist majority, Federalists at the time, guys, believed in a strong national government. And that was something that was reinforced with the idea of the supremacy clause. They effectively told the state of Maryland, and virtually any state with this ruling, because it establishes a precedent, that you cannot tax a national bank, that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And that can be seen within his arguments here, that the supreme law of the land means the supreme law of the land. But it's important to note as well that while there are powers granted to the federal government explicitly within the expressed powers, where a lot more controversy comes into play is with the implied powers. Even the creation of the IRS is not applicable and not allowed in the Constitution, according to a number of conservatives. And we'll see your particular views on that, but it's worth noting about just how controversial those implied powers can be for some. Gibbons versus Ogden kind of extended that supremacy clause out, though in a different way. The supremacy clause can only go so far, as you can imagine. The state governments will push back. So the Federalists interpreted the Commerce Clause in a particular way that allowed for far more federal control as well. What was effectively happening was that the state of New York had its own monopoly, and when people were trying to pass through it, they were charged a pretty hefty fee. But using the Commerce Clause, the Marshall Court determined that the state could not do that, that only Congress could regulate interstate commerce, not the states themselves. This Commerce Clause grew enormous in power over the next century and a half, and was used and applied in a variety of different areas, even in the areas of civil rights. to ban discrimination on businesses that served people in different states. But where that expansion of federal power under the Commerce Clause was ultimately halted was with this particular case, which is U.S. v. Lopez. In this particular case, the District of Columbia had a gun-free school zone, and they'd ultimately authorized that under the Commerce Clause. This was Congress's setting up of a gun-free zone. Remember, it's U.S. Congress that's ultimately the legislative body in D.C. But the court said, no, this does not apply to a gun-free school zone. The Commerce Clause can only go so far. So again, we see this kind of tug of war back and forth between federal and state powers. People with different ideologies are going to have different beliefs about just how much power the federal government should have under the Supremacy Clause and the Commerce Clause. States do retain a good deal of power, even within the Constitution, beyond the 10th Amendment as well. In that, if I have a license in California and I drive into Rhode Island or something, they're not going to ask me for a whole new license, or Nevada or any other state for that matter. Likewise for marriage certificates. If my wife and I are married in California, we're married in the rest of the country, which is what made some of the gay marriage laws rather interesting a few years ago before the Obergefell versus Hodges case. But it's important to note that the national and state share a good deal of powers, which you can see in this middle area here in this Venn diagram, but they also have a separate set of powers here as well. These are powers that only belong to the national government. And these are powers that nearly all belong to the state governments. But you've already seen areas where the federal government has gotten involved with state administration of elections. And you've also seen places where the federal government's providing money for state programs for public health and welfare. So that too can give the federal government some areas there. Once the state governments and the local governments started wanting more money from the federal government, that's where those lines became a lot more blurred. But there are different ways of viewing federalism, and the way that it operates is kind of this dual federalism or cooperative federalism. Let me clarify the difference between the two. In dual federalism, you have like the Internal Revenue Service that collects taxes from us at a national level. So our paychecks, all those paychecks, that portion of that money goes to the Internal Revenue Service. But there's also the state franchise tax board here in California, and our tax money is deferred to the franchise tax board. Whereas in cooperative federalism, that's where federal and state and local agencies work together. For instance, if someone robs a bank in Sacramento, crosses state lines in Nevada, and robs a bank in Reno, well, ultimately it will be the Sacramento Police Department that's involved in there, as well as the Nevada Police Department. But at that point, typically the FBI will get involved and coordinate their efforts between the two different agencies. So the idea here is that there's a good bit of area and issues where the federal, state, and local governments have to operate together. Another big example of cooperative federalism, or what's also marble cake, is where like public health or welfare programs, where the federal government provides state and local governments with a good deal of money to carry out federal programs. Now, the way that many of those programs are carried out are through what are called categorical or block grants. Through categorical grants, the federal government has very, very specific guidelines of you will use this money towards this type of special education program, or you will use this money towards interstate highway systems between these two types of states using these types of materials. Whereas with a block grant, the state governments have they have a great deal more control over that. It's a broad purpose as opposed to a more specific purpose. What I want you thinking about is, which type do you think liberals want more? Which type do you think the federal government wants more? And how might that differ depending upon who's in power in Congress or who's in power with the presidency? Historically, though, it is typically the liberals who want a greater degree of federal control. So which type of grant might they favor more? For about the last century, guys, ever since the Great Depression and the two world wars, as well as the Cold War, the federal government has expanded significantly. And under Johnson's war on poverty, it expanded even more. So a vast amount of control belonged at the federal level because of the power that they were granting. The amount of money and services provided to state and local governments. But conservatives by about the late 70s and early 80s decided this is too much federal control, and they wanted a devolution of federal power. And ultimately, what that means, guys, is that they want more state control. So instead of more categorical grants, they might say, you know what, we need a few more block grants here. And where it had to do with a lot more federal regulations regarding how state and local governments were carrying out federal programs or carrying out federal guidelines or laws, they allowed state and local governments a bit more leeway there. But even with that devolution of federal power, even in the midst of that, you still saw a number of federal mandates being passed. Earlier on in the 70s, you saw things like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. Even as late as in the 1990s, though, under the George H.W. Bush administration, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And many of these mandates were unfunded. That's the interesting thing. So when you look at something like an access ramp here, we looked at one at Wendy's type of thing. It's private business owners that are doling out those costs for those modifications to that. And it's state and local governments that are doing it for their buildings to ensure that anyone that wants to work there can. So they have to set things up that's able for them. Another example where that can get quite tricky, guys, is in the area of Obamacare. Obamacare had to be expanded significantly through the Medicaid program, and state and local governments had to provide the funding for those. Not local governments, strictly state governments. And you can see here that it does say Medicaid costs are shared by the states and the federal government. So when the federal government says, hey, everybody has to have insurance, and it's up to the states to provide that, you can imagine why a number of states would say, hold on a moment, we're not even able to do that. That's why they push back to the extent that they do. But again, it has to do with the amount of trust that they have with the federal government and how much value they see in a federally run healthcare program. And that, folks, is where I'd like to stop today. So again, what I want you considering in this discussion of federalism is how much trust do you have in federal governments as opposed to state and local governments? Okay, how much support and services do you expect from the federal government? And what level of control are you comfortable with them having? That's where I'll stop. I appreciate your time, and I hope you found this informative. Have a good day, everybody.